We begin with Donald Trump's latest attempt to relitigate the 2020 election and lay the groundwork to challenge future elections. A day after the president's primetime address, packed with false and misleading claims about U.S. election security, Democrats blasted his rhetoric as a major election security threat. His Homeland Security Secretary is now threatening legal action against states that refuse federal demands to purge voter rolls. And perhaps most striking, even some of Trump's own supporters are telling him, move on.
I would like to see him move forward and get off that topic, yes. I'd like to get back to what we're really trying to accomplish.
Do you think that the president should be focusing on something else other than elections of years past?
Yeah. I mean, you know, we got nothing going on right now with Iran and everybody. At my age, I guess, I'm just going along with the flow, and it don't make a dang bit of difference.
President Trump used the 25-minute primetime address Thursday to dramatically unveil documents he claimed provided definitive proof of widespread voter fraud. But as MS Now's Laura Barron-Lopez and Vaughn Hilliard report, many of those claims are directly undercut by the very documents the White House released. Let's fact-check a few of his most bald-faced distortions and conspiracies and lies, shall we? Trump claimed China carried out what he called the largest compromise of election data in history, obtaining information on 220 million American voters. What Trump did not mention is that much of that information is already public or can legally be purchased from states for a small fee. Trump claimed that, quote, at a minimum, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, as well as non-state groups have the capability to compromise U.S. election infrastructure. But the intelligence assessment posted by his own administration says something very different, that vote tabulation systems, quote, would be difficult to manipulate on a wide enough scale to compromise election results. Then there's Trump's claim that nearly 280,000 non-citizens are registered to vote. That figure comes from a DHS database that a federal judge called, quote, unreliable, and said that it trampled on Americans' sacred right to vote. Despite that glaring issue, the administration is barreling ahead. DHS Secretary Markwayne Mullin sent a letter to secretaries of state in California, New Jersey, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, warning them to follow the federal government's demands to purge voter rolls or risk legal action. Perhaps most glaring is the contrast between Trump's rhetoric and his senior officials. CIA Director John Ratcliffe, in a long, carefully worded statement, stopped well short of endorsing Trump's election allegations, saying only that the records, quote, shed further light on China's intentions. And listen to what one member of Trump's own election task force told MS Now's Vaughn Hilliard immediately after Trump's speech.
You acknowledge that there were no votes changed in 2020?
All I can acknowledge is what the intelligence shows, right? I only know the intelligence community has zero evidence that someone has flipped, that a foreign power flipped a vote in 2020, 22, or 24.
And so the 2020 election was, in fact, the results as we, the American public.
I'm still researching, so let me. This is the first.
But there's no intelligence.
Not yet.
There is no intelligence that the election would have said that Donald Trump was president.
The president said that tonight.
Oh, go ahead, Vaughn. Joining us now, Scott MacFarlane, Chief Washington Correspondent for Midas Touch and host of Scott MacFarlane Reports, and Jackie Lopez, partner with the Elias Law Group. Thank you both very much for coming to the weekend. There's so much. I don't even know where to begin. I said in the intro that some of the president's own supporters want him to move on, some with some salty language. Let's hear what Bill Cassidy and John Cornyn had to say, their reaction to the president's speech on Thursday. Watch this.
I don't understand talking about what happened 6 years ago. Frankly, as a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, there wasn't a whole lot new. But the bottom line is none of this would have changed the outcome. Right. So I guess I don't get it.
Our electoral system is incredibly decentralized. Yeah. I mean, it's incredibly decentralized. There's not like one place where you can go and control the master election across the country. Every state has their own system, and within that state, there's sometimes subsystems.
And so, Scott, I mean, strong words, particularly from Republicans, something we're not used to hearing. But are we actually going to see these folks step up if indeed the president acts on this groundwork that he's laying come November to try to thwart a free and fair election?
The reaction to Thursday night was so telling. You had Republicans who did choose to comment, the ones who did choose, talking about why the Save America Act is a wonderful idea. They were not endorsing granularly anything the president was saying about China, about voter rolls, about non-citizen voters being on those rolls, about election machines being somehow vulnerable, all of which is nonsense. They were simply detouring towards, hey, let's pass the Save America Act. You had Democrats who were giving a much different reaction, specifically debunking all of the lies one at a time. That's asymmetry. It's just different. I think it gives away the game.
And one of the things that's so interesting, and I've said this on the show, some of this on the show before, if Donald Trump actually cared about our elections, and even with the SAVE Act, if he cared, there'd be money in the SAVE Act. There'll be actual money for states to do the things that he's telling them to do. The bill would be actually about the vulnerabilities that he laid out, because the SAVE Act has jack crap to do with anything that he laid out on Wednesday. There was nothing new in what he laid out. Jack crap. It's very early. You know, my grandmother's watching. He also would not have fired people within the Department of Homeland Security, around the government, who work on this issue. Jackie, and Fox News didn't even play it. So I'm not sure who this was for. I feel like it feels like something that's very concerning. But for me, I'm always like, how many Americans watched what we saw, right? And it seems like not many, because Fox News didn't air the whole thing. And frankly, they were, you know what, we have a side. Let me play this from before the president's address to kind of color this.
Fox News has not seen that evidence yet, is not in a position to evaluate the accuracy of the president's statements and claims at this time.
They did not talk about it much the next day. And what you see right there is they have 787 million reasons to be like, this may not be true, because they had to pay all that money. Your take?
Sure. I think that's responsible journalism, right? The president asked the nation to tune into this address, saying it's going to be this bombshell I have to drop. And then what he did was give this meandering speech. It was a waste of everyone's time.
Totally.
And again, I think the Democrats are right that what he was doing was just laying the groundwork based on these conspiracy theories that their own documents that he released refute, right? To lay the groundwork to say, I, Donald Trump, I'm going to have to exert control in the midterms. I'm going to have to step in. And the reason he wants to
some pretext.
Totally. And the reason he wants to do that is he knows his party's unpopular. They've done nothing for the American people. The economy's struggling. Inflation's out of control. He's fighting a war no one likes. The Republican senators also know they're about to lose. And that's why you hear them just say, oh, sure, Save America. We're not going to talk about this nonsense, because that's all they have left is this desperate attempt to change the rules of the election using authority the president does not have and overturn the will of the voters. And it's really terrifying. And so I respect the news networks that said, we're actually not going to air this.
You said doing things that, the president doesn't have the authority to do. So what exactly do you think he may try to do in the lead up to November, maybe on Election Day, right after Election Day? What do you expect to see, and how are people preparing for it?
Great question. I think more people should be talking about this. So we've already seen a lot of it, right? He's passed executive orders trying to say, I get to decide who's eligible to vote, who's eligible to get a mail ballot. He has laid the groundwork
But those were all rejected in courts.
Correct. The Democratic Party, to its great credit, immediately sued him, has had great success in fighting back against those orders. The courts have been clear. The President of the United States does not have authority. The Constitution says states set the time, place, and manner of elections, not the President of the United States. But that isn't stopping him from continuing to try, right? The Save America Act tries to do a lot of the things that courts have said he can't do. So it hasn't stopped him. He's going to keep trying those same things. I also think we can't forget about the Fulton raid, right? He's getting ready to use the FBI to try to seize ballots. He just fired the EAC commissioners. I wouldn't be surprised if he tries to decertify voting machines, right? It's all wrapped together, right? We can't trust the election security. There's no more EAC. We need the FBI to go in and investigate. We're criminally threatening election officials that aren't going to do what I say, right? It's all laying the groundwork to decide who can vote and how votes can be cast.
And Scott, on that point of what he may try to do, Congressman Jim Himes was on with our colleague Lawrence O'Donnell immediately after the speech, and he laid out a scenario that he thinks the president is up to. Watch this.
Understand what happened tonight. The president was setting the context. He was setting the basis for him to turn around at midnight on Election Day and say, I warned you. I warned you back in July that the Chinese were doing XYZ and the Venezuelans were doing XYZ and all this terrible stuff. It happened tonight. I am deploying federal officers from the Department of Homeland Security to 7 states. They will be seizing ballot boxes in those states because we know that lots of undocumented aliens voted in those things. So we are seizing ballot boxes. Now, Lawrence O'Donnell, what happens when all of a sudden we've lost the chain of custody of 70 ballot boxes in critical? That is the moment in which American democracy dies.
And so for me, Scott, that was very alarming because Jim Himes, he is not excitable, but he was excited that day. But why should the American people be concerned about this idea of the loss of the chain of custody of ballots?
I talked to Mark Warner, who has the Senate version of Jim Himes' job, top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, who says this was an unequivocal attempt to screw with the 2026 elections. The speech was. And yes, the chain of custody is a critical component of that, as Jacqueline would tell you. That is the fundamental underwriting to confidence in the ballots, that we know where they were, we know where they are, and the electronic machines lie. That one stuck with me. The president trying to undermine confidence in those machines. We don't just have confidence in the machines. We have a system to ensure everybody has trust in them. They're audited before and after. They're tested before and after. Both parties are there when the audits and the tests are done. We have a paper backup to ensure everybody has confidence in what's going through the machines. They're not connected to the internet, just like our toaster is not connected to the internet unless you got one of those new toasters. I wouldn't mind a smart toaster.
Absolutely not.
There's not just a faith in these machines. There's a system, and the chain of custody on the ballot boxes is part of that system where everybody can be confident.
So much of these lies have been pressed by the right, but Fox News did not talk about the speech a lot the next day, though they showed the whole speech on air that night. It's very interesting. I don't know.